the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, so we see the support of the deposition of the European Union and several rounds of sanctions against Russia, and EU's deep solidarity with Ukraine. And so in line with these developments, Ukraine presented its application for EU membership in February 2022 and granted candidate status in June 2022. In addition, the European Union provided emergency assistance to the country, emergency support program, and recently Ukraine facility since June 2023, which is an important financial instrument to provide support, flexible support to Ukraine until 2027. So what we see here is that the European neighborhood policy was somehow reshaped with the membership perspective given to Ukraine, considering the dynamics of the Russia-Ukraine war. So here we see the details about the Ukraine facility as an important financial instrument supporting reconstruction, modernization of Ukraine, as well as its capacity building and other technical programs. Well, Moldova is another, I think, country that has directly faced with significant challenges, especially with the start of Russia-Ukraine war. Especially when we consider the start of the relations, again, similar instruments, we have free trade agreement. EU had free trade agreement with Moldova, and that both parties have economic cooperation, and that EU also provided important financial assistance also to Moldova, especially with the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. The European Union, mobilized financial instruments, financial assistance to Moldova, and that it also have provided some kind of a EU path, in the sense that the Republic of Moldova also presented its application for EU membership in March 2022, and it was granted candidate status in June 2022. Of course, the European Union provided a roadmap also for Moldova in terms of its progress in its path towards the European Union. And you may, imagine those things were related more with, justice system reform, fighting with corruption, involving civil society, protection of human rights related issues. But the important thing is that we see that European perspective also given to Moldova, especially considering its support, considering the EU's support of Ukraine. Well, Belarus is a country in the Eastern Partnership perspective, but it is really a specific case because when we look at the relations between the two parties in 2016, 2017, so both parties had good trade relations. The European Union supported Belarus for human rights dialogue, energy program. The societies have certain mobility and that they participated in that mobility programs. But the thing is that Belarus has suspended its participation in the Eastern Partnership as of June 2021. And since October 2020, the European Union has progressively imposed restrictive measures in response to the developments in Belarus regarding their support of Russia. In the southern part, regarding South Caucasus countries, we have three important countries: Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Well, EU-Armenia relations mostly, depend on this enhanced partnership agreement, which was operational since June 2018. And this partnership agreement had a focus on mutual global political and economic interests and stronger cooperation in energy, transport, environment, and trade. So these countries mostly, the energy, trade, transportation, and related issues are important. And of course, in these countries, again, the European Union prioritizes its values regarding rule of law, supporting cooperation between the parties, etc. Again, the same financial instruments are put into practice with Armenia as well. So here in this chart, also we see in more detail EU-Armenian relations. From the economic perspective, EU emerges as Armenia's biggest export market. The European Union supports democratic governance reforms in Armenia with respect to human rights issues. Regarding transportation, energy exchange, we see connectivity between the parties. Also, EU-Armenia visa facilitation and readmission agreement was operational since 2014, and we have, many students that benefit from Erasmus Plus and related projects between EU and Armenia. Azerbaijan, especially considering...
Nevra, I'm sorry to interrupt, just to let you know that 15 minutes are gone already, so that you know that, okay?
Okay, so I will wrap up in a few minutes, okay?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, so Azerbaijan is really an important, I think, partner of the European Union, especially in the changing dynamics of Russia-Ukraine war. The relations is based on, again, partnership and cooperation agreement, but Azerbaijan emerges as an important energy partner for the European Union. So we can here clearly see the importance of the country and how both parties engage with each other from economic governance and connectivity perspective. So regarding the connectivity, I think here I would like to underline that the European Union, Azerbaijan emerges as an important energy partner for the European Union, which currently supplies 5% of the EU's gas demand. And this actually, I think, increases the strategic importance of Azerbaijan for the European Union. And Georgia, Georgia is a country which is being given the European perspective. There has been visa-free travel of Georgian citizens since 2017, and Georgia also applied for EU membership in March 2022, and that Georgia was given that European perspective. So when we consider the post-2020 period regarding Eastern Partnership perspective of the European Union, we see that the European Union has reinforced resilience in its relations with Eastern Partnership countries, that it gives importance to strategic communication between the EU and its Eastern Partnership countries, because there have been new challenges and opportunities, and the European Union has to reshape its neighborhood policy accordingly. In that respect, the EU wants to work closely with the Eastern partners in bilateral and regional format, especially with Azerbaijan, Georgia. The security dialogue, strategic security dialogues with these countries are important. Security cooperation in its relations with Eastern partners has become more important. In addition, when we look at the issue from the economic perspective, also we see that the European Union has increased its investment and it increased its financial, economic and investment plan to the area. So this actually picture reveals the importance given to Eastern Partnership countries concerning the changing dynamics that was triggered by Russia-Ukraine war. So as a conclusion, considering the analysis of all these fact sheets and the related reports, we can say that the European Union has reshaped its European neighborhood policy as well as its common security and defense policy in response to geopolitical realities. In that respect, we see now in the European neighborhood policy a membership perspective for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Also, these dynamics has changed EU's security role in Eastern Europe, and that the European Union wants to be more actively engaged with the Eastern partners. And we can clearly see this in EU's missions in Ukraine, Moldova, and Armenia. So we can say that in the north, the European membership perspective was given for the countries of Ukraine, Moldova. For the Southern Caucasus countries, their strategic importance has increased with the changing dynamics, and that we see EU's high strategic engagement in South Caucasus via developing bilateral relations and regional cooperation and connectivity with these countries to have a more inclusive and flexible Eastern Partnership perspective. These would be my concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nevra, and for this conclusion, making the linkages between this policy that is not new, it's over 2 decades now, it's 2 decades now, and the new geopolitical environment. But we will have time, of course, for some discussion of your presentation. Thank you very much. So now I will give the floor to Luyu Mao, right, who stands second in our list of papers. Again, if you could just please tell us a bit where you are and what are your research interests. It would be nice to know a bit more about you. Thank you. So 15 minutes, please, Mao. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's my honor to take part in this meeting, and now I will share my screen with you. So wait a minute.
Okay.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Perfectly.
Yeah, okay. Good morning, everyone, and it's pressure for time, so I will begin now. We divided our paper into four sections, and here we will begin with the first section, the introduction. We all know that the traditional geographical view is that the security is interconnected with geographic location, and states will form agents based on their geopolitical characteristics. However, with the development of globalization, firstly, the security agents are not always effective in avoiding risks. And after the Cold War, the international community has been trying to avoid conflicts, but regional conflicts have occurred from time to time. and security risk seems unavoidable. And thirdly, globalization, on the other hand, has brought the international community closer together, but it has also become a risk multiplier, causing the risk of regional conflicts to extend indefinitely. Today, the increase of risk have led to a change in the way states respond to security risks. Many countries have begun to rely on globalized networks of relationships to form security cooperation mechanisms. Such mechanism transcends the geographic limitations, and we call this phenomenon of security disending. Then how does this phenomenon arise? How do security risks lead states to choose to delocalize their society, their security? Sorry, this paper attempts to put forward a hypothesis about the phenomenon of security disending and explores the UK's response to the Bosnia War and the Russian-Ukrainian War. And here is the second part of our paper, the theoretical assumptions. The main framework of this paper is informed by big theory of the risk society as well as Giddens' theory of modernization. Giddens' modernization theory states that one of the characteristics of modernism is disembedding. Disembedding refers to the fact that people rely on symbolic tokens and expert systems to overcome the cognitive difference. So modern societies no longer have cognitive difference in values, history, and culture due to geographical constraints. And the mediums that carry these values, history, and culture can also transcend geographical constraints. Putting this theory into the context of the international community, we can consider the symbolic tokens as security interests and the expert system as a security mechanism between countries. The same security interests transcend space, allowing states to understand each other's security interests, even if they are not located in the same region. As a medium for carrying security interests, security mechanisms promote mutual understanding of security interests among states as they interact with other states across geographies. Based on the above theory, this paper presupposes that for national security, the symbolic tokens of security is the concept of security interests, whereby the state cooperates with countries or regional organizations whose interests match its own, so as to safeguard its own security interests from being compromised and to achieve the disembedding of security interests. When countries have different perceptions of risk and options for disembedding, the following four patterns of behavior emerge. Yeah. Sorry, my PowerPoint gets some wrong. Okay, here is the four patterns. And then here is our analytical model. The globalization of risks has prompted countries to construct cross-regional security mechanisms by means of security disembedding to bind their own security interests to cross-regional countries with similar interests, and to establish global security cooperation in order to counteract security risks. However, whether a state chooses to disend is also closely related to the size of the risk it faces and its perceived security interests. This paper shows two cases. Firstly, when the UK recognized that the Russia-Ukraine war posed a threat to its national security, and that the old regional security mechanism's effect was very limited. It actively sought to disarm and build a global security risk countermeasure mechanism, which is a positive case. And in contrast, the UK perceived the war in Bosnia as a civil war due to religious and political difference that did not pose a clear threat to its own security. And when regional security cooperation mechanisms were still effective, it showed little intention to disending, which is a negative case. These two cases will be discussed in contrast below. And here we began with the Bosnia War first. Before the outbreak of the war in Bosnia, Britain's involvement in this affair relied on the framework of the EC and was very cautious about the use of force, rapidly denying the EC's rapid resolutions on the disputes of an intervention force, and advocating that the insurgents should be compelled to negotiate, not to fight. However, the EC not bring peace to this region and hoped, and the war in Bosnia began in 1992 with the implementation of the arms embargo regulation and the NATO's military involvement. Britain's policy of non-interference in Bosnia was loosened. Its actions in this region were mainly focused on the provision of humanitarian aid and the implementation of the arms embargo. But it was still resolute in drawing a clear line between the behavior of armed intervention and humanitarian relief. In contrast, the UK has shown a high degree of concern of the Russo-Ukrainian issue, and after 2014, in the face of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, the UK has been actively promoting military and security assistance to Ukraine, and has gradually shown a centrifugal tendency towards the EU. This is due to the EU's fortune in recent years in the Ukrainian crisis and the refugee crisis and other security issues. The distrust of this mechanism forced the UK to leave the EU and seek security cooperation outside Europe. After the Russo-Ukrainian war starting in 2022, the UK's assistance to Ukraine was not interrupted, but even strengthened. In November 2022, the new British Prime Minister David Sunnak's visit to Ukraine, confirming that the UK would continue to support Ukraine's fight for freedom. Overall, in the Bosnia War, the UK was confident in its perceptions of its own security and focused mainly on maintaining European stability. So it chose to use force cautiously under the EU and maintain limited intervention in Bosnia wars. Whereas the fortune of the EU and NATO in the Russo-Ukrainian war exacerbated the UK's anxiety about its own security, and the turbulent international situation caused it choose to cooperate with Ukraine and to conclude security communities with extraterritorial countries. And the two regions have some commonalities. Firstly, both of them belong to the former Soviet Union, and both of them have evolved from intra-regional armed conflicts to full-scale wars. And thirdly, both of them have attracted the attention and intervention of regional security mechanisms such as the EU and NATO. However, the UK's perception of the risk of these two cases is significantly different, and it has always maintained a non-involvement attitude towards the Bosnia issue and has actively intervened in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We think the difference in the way the UK responds to these two wars stems from the difference in its perceptions of the different risks. This difference in perception is caused by complex geographical, historical, economical, and political factors. And in Russo-Ukrainian wars, British response to the risk began with the Budapest Memorandum and the construction of series of preventive mechanisms, which was quite positive. However, with the expansion of NATO to the east, the regional security cooperation mechanism has gradually become a source of conflict. Ukrainians' pro-Western tendency in security cooperation was an important trigger for Russia's use of force against it. Realizing this, the UK has begun to try to get rid of the out-of-control mechanism and actively look for new friends outside of the region, hoping to build a new security cooperation with extraterritorial countries to share similar security perceptions. And shared security interests are an important basis for the UK to build a mechanism for security disembedding. In addition to the background of globalization of risks and its own anxiety about risks, the UK's disembedding mechanism also needs extraterritorial countries with the same security perceptions as a landing point for disembedding, so as to establish a two-way global security cooperation. And taken together, this paper argues that the interaction between Britain's security perceptions and the security disembedding mechanism in the two worlds corresponds to the two patterns of self-sustaining and self-improving and security community, respectively, and that the level of risk perceptions and the effectiveness of the original mechanism are the most important factors contributing to the disembedding of the country's security or not. Okay, and here throughout the text, we can make the following conclusions about the phenomena of security disembedding. Firstly, in the era of globalization, countries and regions that are more globalized are more sensitive to security risks. Secondly, in the era of globalization, the interests of countries are increasingly linked and a common cognitive base has been established, which makes the establishment of a disembedding mechanism more likely. And thirdly, the new characteristics of risk in the era of globalization has led to a significant changes in the way the states respond to risk. In short, security risk in the era of globalization have taken on a stronger global dimension, posing new challenges to the states and international mechanisms. The security disembedding mechanism is one of the global risk response methods chosen by sovereign states, which is represented by the UK. This kind of cooperation network needs the same perception of security interests and also needs the state's low sense of ontological security and high existential anxiety, and is often the alternative option in the case that the original security mechanism falls. As for the effectiveness of the practical application of such a security disembedding mechanism, time and practice are still need to verify it. And here's our reference, and thanks for your listening.
Thank you very much, Luyu, for your presentation and for being really sharp on the 15 minutes orientation. So we will now move to the third presentation. I recall everyone, because I think not everyone was there when we started the panel, that Adrian Pogashen could not join us today for very legitimate reasons, but we have another paper that perfectly fits into the topic. It will be presented by Licínia Simão. She will be added to the program. From the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And I give the floor to Licínia, who will present a paper that we are co-authoring and working on it at the moment. Thank you, Licínia. The floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Sandra. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you to the organizers for accepting this short minute paper in the conference. I'm really happy to participate again. And congratulations to WAL and its partners for keeping the conference. Its 10th anniversary. I think it's proof of the work well done and the relevance of these discussions. The paper that Sandra and I are developing the title that we have is called Portugal and the Easternisation of Europe's Security and Defense Policies. As we mentioned, we are still developing the paper. So in a sense, this is an opportunity for us to present to you the ideas that we want to develop and hear also your feedback to help us develop the paper through. So I think that's what conferences are also for. Sandra and I have worked together. We have similar interests in terms of EU security and defense policies, also EU policies towards the countries in Eastern Europe and beyond, so the former Soviet space, Russia and others. And so this is a bit of a spin-off for us to look at what the Easternization, what we've called the Easternization of Europe's security and defense policies means for the EU integration process, for cohesion inside inside NATO, and we do that by looking at a case, of course, that we are familiar with, which is Portugal. So, in a sense, I think we are trying to contribute to the debate of what does this new shift towards the East mean for already ongoing integration processes that we are so familiar with. So we start with the literature on small states and marginality to understand what strategies countries in this position use to leverage their national interests, and in this case, how they do that in the context of the ongoing integration in terms of security and defense, not only in NATO, which is of course a long-standing process, but more increasingly so also in the EU under the EU defense policy that is fastly developing, and of course the war in Ukraine just sped up this process. So how is a country like Portugal adjusting to this? So the literature on small states and marginality helps us here. Just very quickly, some key issues that we intend to address or we are considering addressing. Small states tend to leverage their relative marginal position through bargain or trying to capitalize on their unique selling points to the multilateral groups that they integrate. So if small states tend to look for the issues that they are expert on or the specificities that geography brings to their diplomatic relations and so on, and try to leverage that against the obvious imbalance of power that they face in bigger settings. For small states also, national interests, of course, tend to become much more intertwined with collective interests. That's why multilateralism is of interest to so many small states, because in multilateral settings, the interests of bigger powers become intertwined with the interests that small states have. And so this is something to take into consideration when we look at the current context. Another note that I would like to make at this point is that for small states and for these processes of leveraging power, context is quite important. So a favorable context can mean that small states can more easily advance their interests and find selling points that make them more relevant for other more powerful actors. But likewise, if the context is not favorable, they will be even more disadvantaged. So we need to take this into consideration when we look at the case study that we have as well. And so when we look at the case of Portugal, these are some of the issues that we are that we are seeing and that we need to assess in terms of the impacts that this will have, not only in the position of Portugal, of course, but perhaps more interestingly also on the nature of the integration processes in EU and NATO. So the first issue has to do with perhaps with this concept of Easternization. So what do we mean by Easternization? And here it means both, of course, a geographical shift in threat assessment. And we see that, for instance, when we look at the EU strategic compass or NATO's strategic concept document. So we see that threat assessments are now much more focused on the Eastern Front. These threats are more urgent, they require more attention and means, of course. So all the security efforts that are ongoing, they tend to be more reinforced at the eastern border and also in the countries that are in that region. So that means that both inside EU and NATO, Baltic countries, Poland and Romania, for instance, will be much more relevant for the efforts that are ongoing, but also the attention will be focusing much more on Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and others that we've heard also before. What Easternization also means is that there is a shift in decision-making inside the EU. And the long-term effects of this shift are something that concerns a small country like Portugal much more than necessarily the threat assessment, because I think we can balance the threat assessment by pointing out that what is happening in the south is also relevant for managing the conflict in the east, but the shifts in decision-making tend to create path dependence, and therefore this will have a lingering effects on how countries in the margin or far away from the center of decision can contrary this trend. So also we need to add to this that enlargement perspectives will tend to reinforce that trend of Easternization. If we look at the Balkan accession, now the perspectives for Ukraine and Moldova, but also, of course, Turkey's accession process. So the focus tends to be for the EU to look at its eastern dimension rather than its southern dimension, where previous enlargements have kind of settled the borders of the EU there. So we also need to understand that not only the trend to Easternization has been felt with the previous enlargement, of course, with so many Central and Eastern European countries entering the EU, but also there is another factor. The Troika interventions in the post-2008 crisis really made the role of the southern countries much more fragile. We all remember how the divisions inside the EU left the countries in the south in a poor position. And also, for instance, if you want to consider that the US is very important and relations with the US are very important for the security and defense policies, both of NATO and the EU. For a country like Portugal, which was always a privileged interlocutor for the United States in Europe, the enlargement of the EU and NATO to other Atlanticist countries in Central and Eastern Europe has also made Portugal less relevant for the global power in that case. So we are at a conjunction where Portuguese national security and defense interests will need to be reassessed and readjusted with this Easternization movement. So this is what we mean by Easternization. I think it's a process that has many dimensions, and we hope that the paper can tease that out also for our audiences. The second element, when we look at the application of these theories of small states and how they promote their interests, and looking at the case of Portugal, is that Portugal has used its contributions to NATO missions and EU missions to present itself as a committed partner to both projects, as a partner committed to solidarity among allies, and of course, keeping a privileged interlocution with global powers. I'm thinking here, of course, the US and France and the UK. So by participating in complicated missions for NATO, like Iraq or Afghanistan, and in the Balkans, for instance, Portugal was always positioned itself as a leading contributor power, engaged, available. And also in the EU, Portugal has participated in all EU military missions from day one. All of them have had a participation of Portuguese forces. So this is a capital that Portugal, of course, has been harnessing for itself in its conversations with its partners. However, maybe just another element here has to do, of course, with the multilateral. Portugal has also been very much engaged in multilateral formats for peace and security, kind of reinforcing also its availability to contribute with military stuff. However, when we look at the ongoing processes of speeding the common security and defense policy, NATO's focus more on territorial defense and deterrence, we see the difficulties that a country like Portugal is facing in keeping up with these trends, because the contributions that we were making were more to the out of area missions for NATO, for the expeditionary forces that went and supported stabilization elsewhere. When the focus is now on territorial defense and strategic assets for deterrence, a country like Portugal tends to be in a more difficult position to contribute, because great powers have the means for territorial defense more often and for deterrence. So we need to reassess also to what extent our contributions need to be adjusted. And of course, this will mean a more demanding situation for our national budget, more investment at a time, of course, when also Portugal is facing the economic impacts, like most countries in Europe, of the war in Ukraine and the crisis, the post-COVID crisis, and so on. So increases in defense spending put, of course, a great strain on national resources, and this will tend to be something that may make the position of Portugal more fragile. Another element, before moving on to the conclusions, is, of course, Portugal's geopolitical interests. They tend to lie more on the south, on the southern flank, than on the eastern flank. And for the moment, security concerns in the south are a second-tier priority for global powers, for regional powers. So there has been a constant effort by the Portuguese diplomacy to link the issues, the security issues in the south with the security situation in the east, namely pointing out to Russia's activities in Africa and elsewhere, and linking this to this narrative of global competition that, of course, we see becoming more institutionalized now with the enlargement of BRICS, and with a much more active foreign policy in the south, both by the US and the European Union, just thinking of this global gateway project that the Commission has been pushing forward as a means to be more present and kind of reinforce partnership with the global south. So in that sense, of course, Portugal has been trying to counter this tendency of less attention being paid to security issues in the south, where it has a clear priority and where Portugal is a relevant interlocutor, but other elements are making this difficult. If you think, for instance, that piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, which had been a major concern for the EU over the last decade, has now decreased for 2 or 3 years in a row, meaning that the tendency is to look at those issues as being solved, at least from the perspective of the European nations and their commercial interests there. So the tendency will be for less investment on the Gulf of Guinea. If you look at other security concerns in African conflicts, even though they are highly relevant for security in Europe, they will tend to be seen as less prioritary right now. So, of course, the country lacks the means to act alone in many of these countries, unlike, for instance, France. And also, besides lacking the means to act alone, this idea that Portugal is a privileged interlocutor with Africa or with Latin America, it's still true, but we are no longer we don't have a monopoly on that interlocution, which means that other countries are also good interlocutors these days. And so this is also a challenge for our diplomacy and for the promotion of our interests. Finally, also on this issue, on the relations with the South, the fact that Portugal has been from day one aligned with Western powers and within the Western Bloc in responding to the Ukraine war with solidarity and of course condemning Russia's actions in line with US and other European powers. This has also taken a toll on its ability to speak with the global South. So this is, we need to balance the pros and cons of this, and we need to understand how Portugal may be perceived as lacking independence from these powers, and therefore making its interlocution perhaps less relevant or less interesting for Southern powers at the current moment. So in overall, the context over the last couple of years perhaps has not been the most favorable for Portugal. So my conclusions, our conclusions, basically this idea that small states, we have a more difficult time in shaping EU defense policies and NATO strategy in the context of global power rivalry and the focus on territorial defense and deterrence. Unless these small states are directly engaged in the conflict. And of course, Portugal is contributing to the efforts in securing the Eastern Front since 2014, and has also been able to have Eastern European countries participate in missions in Africa, creating here this solidarity, but we are not directly engaged in the conflict, and so we will tend to be marginalized as a small country. Participation means, of course, financial and political efforts that can destabilize national politics and societies, and we will need to see how far Portugal will manage these financial and human effort that an ongoing war in the Eastern Front may put on our resources, and that will speed up the defense integration process in the EU. For small and peripheral states who value their geographical position and their multilateral apparatus, the current context may pose short-term challenges. Portugal has been inside the ad hoc multilateral formats that have conveyed to support the war effort and so on. We are, of course, EU members and NATO members, and this means that we participate, but multilateralism in itself has been marginalized. Yes. 15 minutes are gone?
Oh, yes, 3 minutes ago.
Okay, so just to finish, there remain, of course, opportunities to tie issues together, to build coalitions, and to value its role as an interlocutor, but risks are much higher at this stage. And the mid and long-term effects in the Euro-Atlantic integration need also to be assessed for our understanding of what this Easternization movement means for a small country like Portugal. So thanks so much, Sandra, for your time.
Thank you very much, Licínia, for presenting our ongoing research. And also, I think it's really valuable, all these dimensions that you raised, like on the case study as such, empirically, what does it mean for Portugal? What is at stake? So the challenges are both in terms of identity and interest, despite the official support to the reinforcement of the Eastern flank. So thank you very much. The next paper is the one that I will present, and following the order here of the presentations, and it also involves Portugal as a case study. And I will ask kindly Licínia to moderate my presentation. Okay, in terms of time, it's nicer if I can just be cut at the proper time if I'm exceeding the time. Okay, and then we will move to Amber's presentation that is last, but no, of course not least in the order of presentation. So I've been able to quickly prepare a PowerPoint this morning before I join you. So I will, okay, can you?
We can see it, Sandra, go ahead.
We can see it, okay, thank you very much. So as you might notice, the title is different because good news in the meantime between the organization of the panel and the presentation during the conference. And thank you so very much to CESRAN, to WAL for the great work in putting the program together, in making the necessary adjustments last minute as well. So thank you very much for all your work, and for this, as Licínia underlined, the resilience and the success of the conference is really amazing. So a change in title because it's published now. So it has been accepted and it's published. So you can find, that is why I will not go so deep in the case studies as such. I will really present the big lines of this research because it's already out now. So it's a comparison of the Czech and Portuguese engagements in the European defense market. And it's an analysis. So as I mentioned, it's already published. It's in the Journal of Common Market Studies. It's out since late August, so it's really, really fresh. It's a bit more than 50 days availability now, open access, so everyone can read it. You don't need to pay these fees to have access. So the title is Institutional Inertia and Change, explaining the Czech and Portuguese engagement in European defense market integration. This is a research that has been conducted with Thomas Weiss from the Charles University in Prague and Miroslava Pisklová, also from the same institution, and myself. So it's co-authored by Thomas and Miroslava and myself. So why
excuse me, Sandra?
Yes?
There is a pop-up in your PowerPoint from the PowerPoint. There's a pop-up, like a small window that is preventing us from seeing the full screen. Can you see it?
On the right down part of the screen.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see. Okay.
There you go.
Disappeared. Okay. Thank you very much for this, Licínia. Okay. Now I will. Okay. So so you can access it directly by yourself online. So why this focus? Actually, the focus was on two initiatives that arose from 2017 onwards at the EU level, PESCO and EDF, so the European Defence Fund, which came a bit later, and the structured partnership for the whole idea is to try to integrate the defense market at the EU level. So the question that we raised in our research is why Czechia and Portugal engage differently in these two initiatives, both in terms of the negotiation phase, but also in their participation in the projects that were launched within the PESCO framework and also funded through the European Defence Fund. So this is a comparison between two small countries. We, of course, explain why we deem possible and important to compare these two countries. And they were both challenged by the integration of the European defence market that can be seen as both opportunities and risks for these two countries. So the risks are the ones that well known for the ones studying the European defense markets. It's the size of the big companies of the big member states, the difficulties of the small countries to add value in the supply chains, so to add values in terms of value to their economies as well in this construction of the defense market. So we looked at their involvement until 2021. After that, the Russia-Ukraine war changed the context a lot, and context is important, of course, to look at these initiatives. But at the same time, despite the change in context, and of course, the huge amount of money that has now come into the EU defense sector because of the war in Ukraine, it cannot be translated into integration of defense market if it comes without institutions and previous efforts. So PESCO and EDF, and yesterday there was a conference of the European Defense Agency, the annual conference, and these projects were really into discussions in this conference. So despite the fact that our timeline goes until there and we have this change in context, still these questions are so very much important to understand if the integration of the defense market is still possible at all in the new context of the war in Ukraine. So basically, we departed from not really a willingness to explain the EU defense market and the EU defense integration. Also, it's an input for that. We will really look at the domestic perspective. So how the public and the private sectors of these countries influenced the way these countries were able to jump into these initiatives, to contribute to them, but also to benefit from them. So we looked at the role of the institutions, public ones, but also the defense industries of these countries. And we tried to assess how these institutions, public and private, explain the difference of engagement, because there is a difference of engagement of these two countries. So the pertinency is about what is well known and usually called the military-industrial complex, which makes a huge linkages between the state procurements and the defense procurements, and also the fact that when we look at these initiatives, it's because also market consolidation in the defense sector in the EU never reached the same depths as that of the United States. So we are still in a world that is in the making, with the accelerator of that has been provoked by the war in Ukraine. So the main conclusions as I said, I will talk a bit more, of course, about the paper, but I will not go very deeply in the analysis because it's published now. But I give you the main conclusions right away, saying that we explain the differences of engagement between Portugal and Czechia. So Portugal engaged much more significantly. Despite being less active at the launch of the projects, it engaged much more significantly than Czechia. And we explain that by the differences of institutionalization in respective countries. So institutions explain, but they do not explain only the differences because of the different institutions, but also because of the ideas that were embedded by the actors in these institutions. So in terms of contribute to the literature, we used the framework of historical institutionalism. So as I said before, in terms of explaining the differences between the two, and our main argument is that existing institutions, so as both agency or even established ways of thinking, so as I said, ideas, explain why the evolution was distinct for the two nations' engagement. And as I said, the paper is really about understanding domestic institution, internal dimensions, and not really the defense industrial cooperation at the EU level per se. Okay, so it's really about the role of national institutions in policy formulation. But of course, the results, the outcomes of our research are useful to understand what's going on at the EU level as such, because Portugal and Czechia are two small states that are member states of both the EU and NATO. So we did a separation between three phases, 3 moments, 3 periods. First, the establishment of the defense industry or institutions of these countries before 2017. So before PESCO and EDF proposals, we looked at the negotiations phase of these proposals and then at the implementation phase. So how these countries were involved in the first PESCO and EDF projects. So
5 minutes, Sandra.
How much?
5.
5, thank you very much. So we looked at 2 hypotheses. First, if we could explain the difference between the 2 countries by the existence of established institutions that govern the defense industry. And these institutions usually cannot be easily changed. And then a second hypothesis that is not like disconnected or contradictory to the first one. It's actually a complementary one that was very useful for us to make the research, is if we can explain the difference by the distinct ideas embodied in and perpetuated by the defense industry institutions. And as I said, of course, besides the contribute to the literature of historical institutionalism, we also, of course, contribute to understanding better the practice of European defense cooperation. But I will just add here some additional, because I have at least 3 minutes more. I would not like to end like this the presentation. I would like to share a bit more about our conclusions. What was striking for us is that in fact, institutions pre-existing the initiatives were really a key difference for Portugal and Czechia. Portugal was already in the road of creating new institutions to be more active and to create a more efficient industry of defense in Portugal. And these initiatives came at a moment where Portugal was already in the movement, in the dynamic of institutional innovation to be a bigger player or better player and to serve its economy through the defense industry. The Czech Republic had already embedded institutions, and the state was already supporting the defense industry primarily through state acquisitions and offsets. So when the new structures came at the EU level, actually it didn't really mesh well with the cooperation logic that PESCO and EDF prescribed. So it was a real contrast with the Portuguese institution that had no resilient institutional structure in place for these defense industry policies. So when they came, it meant for Czechia reforming already embedded practices. For Portugal, it was just jumping, right? Seizing the opportunity, an additional opportunity to create new institutions and to change its way of engagement. And it was really clear as well in terms of ideas involved in these political priorities. So it translated into very active, Czechia was more active in the negotiation phase, in the initial phase, but then Portugal ended up with much more leading projects and more skeptical. We had to use a lot of interviews because we didn't have secondary resources to analyze what we wanted to analyze. And interviews really showed that difference between the 2 countries. So we also discovered that when it comes to defense industry policy in Europe at large, the EU level for these 2 countries were indeed secondary, okay? It didn't really change the dynamics of institutional change at the national level. Despite the fact that we can see the use of EU budget in defense policy as revolutionary before 2021, and I think we can try to draw some perspectives for the new context of the war in Ukraine, it was not triggering institutional change in the 2 countries, because in Czechia we had resistance. In Portugal, we already had a novelty happening. So it was, as I said, about creating more synergies with what could come from the EU level. So I will start here. I hope I was not too confusing. But as I said, the paper is out there, so for those interested, you can read it. Thank you very much for your attention. Licínia, how much
The
time?
moderation is back to you. You're right on
Okay.
time, 1 minute short. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much, Licínia. So Amber, it's now a pleasure to hear your presentation, which is the last presentation of the paper. So I ask again if you could just tell us where you are and what are your key research interests besides your presentation. It would be great. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning. I'm Dr. Amber Brittain-Hale, and my research areas have focused principally on the Russo-Ukrainian War, but specifically around public diplomacy. And what this allowed me to do is look at, starting with President Volodymyr Zelensky and his unique brand of public diplomacy from the very first days of the invasion, when he stood out in the streets of Kiev and said, in Ukrainian, the president is here. And what he did with that was create this bounded, identifiable country that maybe wasn't on the radar of Western states very specifically. So looking at what diplomacy has done in the Russo-Ukrainian War really caused me to take a look at foreign policy analysis, and maybe this was an outmoded way of looking at actors at the singular level. So what we have been doing in international relations is blackboxing the state and attributing these powers to the state as if it made decisions all on its own, but to zoom in and really consider that an actor, an individual, has a power, has a brand, has a way of reaching global audiences. This is where it began. So my publication was called Slava Ukraini, a psychobiographical study of Volodymyr Zelensky's public diplomacy. That's where it started. But then to begin to examine the other Euro-Atlantic leaders and their forms of public diplomacy, it began to be very apparent that female-led states had their own strain of diplomacy and what they were speaking about. So some of my other research was able to identify that females in the Euro-Atlantic zone are very specifically, they're distinguishable from Zelensky. Using RStudio, it was proven that their brand of diplomacy measures differently than Zelensky's. However, what caused me to come to this paper today was the fact that Central and Eastern European female leaders had an even more refined brand of public diplomacy, of strategic narrative and informational sovereignty, but it had a very post-colonial sentiment to it, that these female leaders, the ones that are in my study, Kaya Kallas, Fana Marin, Maya Sandu, Shimonetta, and Zora Shlivi, all spoke out very definitively, very strongly against Russian incursion, Russian aggression, Russian war inside of Ukraine. And this is a deviation from what is considered to be feminist foreign policy. It is typically ascribed to women that they are peacemaking, more conciliatory, and softer spoken. But what my analysis has shown is that in fact is outmoded, that it is time to reconsider what female-led diplomacy looks like. And this post-colonial positionality has really emerged and become apparent, especially in these 5 leaders that I looked at. So I've given you a little bit of an overview of what my research has looked at. I think we've covered the Russo-Ukrainian War in this session, but what I wanted to explain more was the rise of female leadership in Eastern European nations and their unique approach to diplomacy, and also understanding that now we have these digital-born methods of communication that help us really understand not only humanities research, such as international relations and some of the social sciences, but to take a new lens to past past diplomatic efforts and use computational analysis to see where these differences lie. But using Luke 22, that's linguistic inquiry and word count, I was able to analyze the tweets of these 5 leaders from 2022 to 2023. It results in scores across many psychometric categories, and there was 5 principal findings of my study, specifically looking at areas that may suggest a post-colonial sentiment or a pro-Ukrainian sentiment. So the categories that specifically revealed a deep consideration of post-colonial narratives or a stronger push against Russian aggression or Russian genocidal declarations was here's the 5 categories that really I examined for this sentiment. It was the cognition, cause, power, negate, and politic, as well as female. Are these leaders using references to gender in their communication, or is there anything specifically that refers back to their gender? Now, understanding that post-colonial diplomacy and pro-Ukrainian sentiment, that can be sparse globally speaking. And this narrative that Russia is a colonial power still, it was historically, and it continues to exercise these behaviors and traits of a colonial power, is not understood much past Western and the US. I think this message is lost in the global South. But if you spend some time really looking at not only Twitter communication, but the public diplomacy of these 5 women, you understand that they are very specific, they're very straightforward, and it's very relevant for understanding post-colonial diplomacy and pro-Ukrainian sentiment, as well as identifying very high scores that show a thoughtful reflection of each of these women, a very clear understanding of them understanding geopolitical tensions, causes, and events, and again, maybe speaking more forcefully than what is traditionally attributed to feminist foreign diplomacy and foreign policy. In one particular interview that then was viral on Twitter, Sanna Marin, for instance, said the way to end the war is for Russia to leave Ukraine. And that was her statement. Russia needs to leave Ukraine. These are very straightforward, again, with more power and resonance about the colonial impact or the colonial history of what is occurring. But what is important to understand is that the women that are speaking in this manner, the women that are studied here in this paper that I'm presenting, they have a geographical proximity and a historical exposure to Russian colonialism. They are very, as a matter of fact, they're in the neighborhood. So this is what led me to look at these women in the first place as I started to zoom in and in, not only on female leadership, but specifically on these women, understanding that their cognitive processes and their power dynamics, as well as the political focus, were distinct from other global leaders. So looking at a couple of things, there is a distinct clarity. All the tweets of these leaders showed a thoughtful and reflective approach, suggesting that they are clear in their considerations and discussions about post-colonial narratives. There's also a consistent use of negation across the leaders' tweets, which indicates they are clear in their stance on certain issues or entities. This can be interpreted as a resistance or an opposition to Russian influence or other geopolitical challenges. And then there are mentions of female-related terms across these tweets, which suggest they understand gender dynamics in diplomacy. There's a lot of coherence across this cohort of female leaders as well. Their tweets indicate discussions about power dynamics, a coherent understanding and presentation of post-colonial narratives, as well as understanding the broader implications in their geopolitical arena. There is a clear understanding of the significant focus on political matters across leaders' tweets, and very typically a coherent narrative. The scores from Luke 22 suggest in their cognitive processes that there's as I mentioned, the deep consideration of post-colonial narratives, as well as situational awareness. And there's also a very clear narrative structure in most public communications of this cohort. In discussions about the power dynamics, the tweets of these leaders effectively convey that there are challenges and implications of post-colonial experiences in Russo-Ukrainian conflict, and there is a deep historical understanding. There's either reference to these states' own experiences with Russian colonialism, or in the case of Kaja Kallas, she has a personal experience with family members being victimized, incarcerated, deported by Russians. These are not only personal, sentimental narratives, they are shared from a position of power, the actual seat of power in these states, and it is reflected in foreign policy of these nations as well. There are more aggressive, defensive postures against Russia in this conflict. So some of my other research looked at the idea of infopolitik and strategic narrative controlling informational sovereignty. This has become increasingly important in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and Twitter has emerged as a crucial platform for diplomacy and infopolitik. This is evidenced by the tweets of these leaders. So whether a speech is given in person and then shared on Twitter, or the narrative is designed to be tweeted, there is still a consistent focus on political matters, power dynamics, and these post-colonial narratives. Twitter happens to highlight the significance, the reach, and virality of each of these female leaders' political communications or public diplomacy, which shapes and conveys geopolitical narrative. Many of these tweets, as I mentioned, touch upon female leadership or gender dynamics in diplomacy. They amplify diverse voices and perspectives in the geopolitical arena. And furthermore, the use of specific linguistic patterns and cognitive processes in these tweets underscore the importance of strategic use of language and messaging to convey diplomatic stances, resist external influences, and shape public opinion. In the context of the Russo-Ukrainian war, Twitter in particular has played a pivotal role in facilitating real-time communication, rallies, international support, and does shape the narrative around the conflict. So looking at insights into leadership communication for the conflict, let me rephrase, in the war. This is distinctly a war. The tweets of these leaders provide valuable insights into leadership communication, not only in state, but internationally as well. There is that focus on political matters and geopolitical stances, but there's also the personal measurement of leadership style. So as I mentioned before, black boxing the state and believing that each state operates as a whole, as an entity, the decisions of Estonia are not made by Estonia as a state. There's still this foreign policy analysis level required to look at the individual, Kaja Kallas, for instance, or when Sanna Marin was at the prime ministership of Finland, there is a personality there, and that is important to analyze at that single actor level because they have agency, and it isn't a foregone conclusion what is going to happen. There's still an individual that needs to be examined in the context of history, of analytics, of diplomacy, using psychobiographical examination methods. linguistic analysis, and some of these more contemporary digital tools. It is critical to understand leadership, especially in the age of aging leaders, understanding cognitive processes, keeping a baseline of leadership communication, and understanding any deviation is also important for future research, in my opinion. So to recap this study's significance in understanding resistance to Russian influence, I would say that each of these nations have developed their own whole of society resistance to not only Russian colonialism, but the Russian aggression in this war. There is a whole of society effort to develop digital protections. There's cybersecurity considerations. There's finance and other state apparatus considerations that are being incorporated. But in all, it is led by a female as the head of state, and those women are spending a good deal of time communicating this message not only to their populations, their civilians in state, but also internationally, because Twitter has become the de facto language of diplomacy. You certainly have noticed that Twitter is where greetings to foreign nations are sent, or condolences. They're also very interactive at the official level. This infopolitique, again, the strategic narrative of a state that is shared on Twitter. So each of these states in the study, as well as the females that lead them, have really spent some time with stakeholder engagement and understanding the temporal dimensions of what public diplomacy is doing. And they have utilized this diverse platform. So understanding that while this study looked at Twitter specifically, future research should look at other social media platforms, Telegram being one of them, which features more videos and more extensive networks in a way that is not the same as Twitter. The real name policy on Twitter can suppress some of the conversations, whereas Telegram is a little more unregulated at this point. There's also opportunities for comparative study between Eastern European female leadership and Eastern European male leadership. That's not something that I have touched yet. And then there's a way to consider a more temporal analysis, looking at the evolution of the messaging tactics and linguistic patterns over time, especially before, during, and after conflicts, which is something I did in the Slava-Ukraini study of Zelensky, looking at 5 phases, but I haven't yet done that for the females. Again, a lot of the leadership paradigms that are utilized at my university, Pepperdine.
I'm sorry, I would.
Okay.
I have to ask you to wrap up, please.
Okay. Well, in conclusion, females are communicating in a very different, distinct manner than they have historically, and they are doing that in a way that is different than their male counterparts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, great wrap up about what you have been looking at. Well, so it was our last presentation. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting one as well. And the papers that have been gathered in this paper really show the richness of the international relations field for an area of study that has been evolving a lot recently. And the richness of concepts, of theories, but also the linkages between different dimensions, different policies that we would probably not link that much into geopolitics. And now today are really part of European geopolitics and somehow part of EU defense policies. So we have, I would say, a comfortable 25 minutes, 24 minutes for discussion now. I will not use my role of discussants in a strict term, because also I didn't have access to the written papers, and two of them I am co-authoring them. So so I think I will ask the audience, because the panel is totally online, I will ask the audience to ask questions in the chat, please. Of course, my colleagues of panel, they can engage in the discussion. I will just throw some considerations and questions in waiting that everyone can warm up and start asking questions. So Nevra, I found it very interesting at the end of the presentation that you somehow mentioned this expression, the Eastern Partnership perspectives. It really reminded me of the enlargement perspective. That was a term that was used to have the countries in the waiting room for a long time, and that led us to enlargement fatigue. I would like to ask you, and it's not compulsory that you answer, it will depend also on the other question that will arise, but do you see that the Eastern Partnership today has gained a momentum now that the enlargement fatigue is somehow overcome? We had yesterday the State of the European Union discourse speech by van der Leyen, by the President of the Commission, and the message was clear: enlargement will happen, and it shall happen before treaty reform. But then in your presentation, you give a great space to the Eastern Partnership, which is very interesting, because we tend to forget that these policies, they are funding, they are happening, they are programs. So how do you see the role of the Eastern Partnership now that the enlargement fatigue is over because of the Ukrainian war, but not the problem about how to enlarge, when, and which methods? Luyu, you had a very, very interesting presentation as well, and around the disembedding security concept. You compared two wars. I was skeptical about the case studies, but you provided a very thorough explanation about why comparing these two, so Bosnia wars and Russia-Ukrainian war. And at some point, you engage with the security community concept for what's happening now about the way the UK engages in Ukraine. How do you see these two concepts in being? I didn't really see the connection between the two concepts, and I'm looking at Licínia because she developed pretty thoroughly the concept of security communities in her PhD thesis concerning the South Caucasus. So maybe you have here things to exchange. I will not comment on Licínia's and my presentation, of course. Amber, yes, it was very interesting. I would like to read you your research, to see who you have interviewed, or not interviewed, but which personalities you have followed through Twitter. Yeah, I see the point. It's really interesting to look, to bring foreign policy analysis to the individuals. So how individuals also matter beyond agency and institutions. So it would be it. I would, for Amber, maybe a question on leadership. How do you define the leadership of these women? And when you were talking, actually, it was echoing in my head, all these people working now on necropolitics and also demasculinization of sovereignty. I don't know if you engage with this literature, maybe it's not what you want to do, but it seems like it's complementary, or the counterpart of what you are doing, looking at these specific actors in a gender perspective. So it would be my initial comments to kick off the discussion, but I would like to ask my colleagues of panel if they want to engage right now, and I would please ask our audience to ask a question, raising the hand or putting the mic on, or writing the questions on in the chat discussion box. So if nobody wants to jump in at the moment, maybe I will ask my colleagues to react to my comments. I don't know if Nevra wants to say something. Your microphone is not on.
Well, thank you very much for your question. So as you mentioned, with changing geopolitical conjuncture due to the Russia-Ukraine war, the importance of enlargement has changed. So the European Union, due to its security concerns, and now Russia has become an important threat for European security, has reshaped its neighborhood policy and put enlargement, let's say, as a priority for certain countries. But this is, I think, not to say that these countries has to fulfill certain conditions. Conditionality approach is really important in the enlargement perspective. And I think for Ukraine and for Moldova and possibly for Georgia, these conditions would be valid. And when we look at EU's approach towards Ukraine and Moldova regarding the enlargement perspective, the European Union also, focuses on a roadmap, which designs that these countries should fulfill certain reforms regarding corruption, human rights issues, economic development, energy security-related issues. So I think these also are the things that is being underlined by the European Union from the enlargement perspective. So while I think discussing the enlargement perspective, I think we need to consider these facts as well. So in that perspective, then we can have a more broad analysis about that issue.
Okay, thank you very much, Nevra. I don't know if Luyu wants to jump in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So the connection is not stable just now, so could you repeat your question?
Yes, I was underlying the way you justified the comparison of these two case studies. That was not self-evident, and I was quite skeptical. So I was saying bravo to that. And at the same time, you presented your research as working on the concept of disembedding security in the perspective of the practice of the UK foreign policy towards these conflicts. But you introduced the concept of security community specifically for the Ukraine-Russia war as a way to explain how the UK is engaging in the war in support of Ukraine. So I would like to ask you if somehow you will connect these two concepts, or if it's a kind of subcategory. This was not clear to me how you managed to introduce to operationalize these two concepts for your case study.
Okay. Here I compare these two cases because some similarities they both have. First, just like what I have introduced in my presentation, I say that they are all belong to the former Soviet Union, and both of them have evolved from the intra-regional armed conflicts to full-scale wars. And thirdly, both of them have attracted the attention and intervention from regional security mechanisms such as the EU and NATO. And so, and I feel they also have some another similarities, but I didn't mention in my presentation because the pressure of time. And so I think these two cases can be compared because to show why the Britain choose to disembowel in 21st century, and that last century in Bosnia War, Britain did not choose to disarm its security because at that time the EC was still powerful and the security can be ensured under the framework of EC. But when it comes to 2020s, the war between Russia and Ukraine broke out, and Britain feels that its security was in face of the threat, so it maybe choose to disarm. That's two cases. One case is that the UK did not choose to disarm, and the other case is that it chose to disarm. And I compare these two cases just to want to illustrate it that what factors makes a country choose to disarm, and what situation will prompt it to choose disarm. And I don't know whether I have answered your questions, but that's what I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luyu. I don't know if Amber wants to jump in.
Certainly. I think your question was, have I reviewed looking at female leadership or demasculinization of diplomacy? Was that the question?
Yes.
So in some of my analysis, in my previous study of Zelensky, I also used leadership trait analysis, and there's a pretty compelling study by Schaefer and Lambert. They created what's called the psychological characteristics of leader. What they did is they aggregated many speeches of leaders for the past couple hundred years. They used leadership trait analysis with Profiler Plus, and then they have an open data set online. So it's a CICP-CL test is what it is. So you can take a peek at leaders and their particular traits, etc. There's probably 10% female in that cohort. So I do think there's an opportunity to start examining these very prominent female figures against a cohort. That's what I did with Zelensky, and his diplomacy is specifically, it's different. His traits are different, and what I anticipated he would score as was different than than what I thought. So because there's very few females in this cohort, even though there's 122 global leaders, I think there's an opportunity to do that, to take a peek and see where we are in 2023 with female-led diplomacy being different than feminist foreign policy. So I appreciate you pointing that out, and I'm certainly going to take a look at expanding my research. Probably like everyone else here, the research agenda is a long piece of paper with a lot of bullet points on that. So I'm looking forward to adding what you've suggested to that list, and I appreciate your comments.
Thank you very much, Amber, and also for specifying a bit more about the cohort and how you looked at it for your research, for the previous one on Slava Ukraini and now the one that you have presented today. Licínia, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to take the opportunity to maybe share a little bit of reflection that some of the research contained in these papers kind of raised in my head. So Sandra made a comment on how the research that we're developing also looks at interest, but looks at something that is that comes before interests and then is shaped by it, which is identity, and then how actors understand their own role and who they are and how they can contribute to specific situations. In politics, we've seen that is an important part of the narratives, of the policy choices, and so on. And so we have all, I think, been sensitive to the issue of identities in international politics. And looking at the current moment in European integration, with not only defense policies so sharply being developed, but also with a very visible and real threat to the East, and coming from a neighbor, Russia, that is so important to the identity of Western Europe and Western European institutions. I was wondering also how, for instance, Nevra considers that in her research in terms of how the neighborhood policy has changed, the identity of the EU, the relations that it has with the neighbors, and how it perceives its role in this broad geographical space that is Eurasia, so Europe, but also its extension towards the Asian continent. Can we speak of a change in identity that then delivers also different tools and instruments for policy making in terms of the neighborhood policy? And I think this reflection is also relevant for the research that Luyu was developing and presenting today. And you mentioned the issue of security communities. In communities, a concept that international politics requires a great deal of or a dense interactions and the densification of common points of interest, and that forms the basis for common identity in some points. And if the research that I was developing 10 years ago could speak of the neighborhood policy as an identity building mechanism or a community building mechanism, I'm not so sure today because of the disruptions that have been ongoing, but also because of the new nature of EU policies in some cases. But I was wondering how much the Brexit and the lack of, and the new form of interaction between the EU and the UK on security issues, on geopolitical issues, and the management of conflicts and crises is also provoking a shift in how the EU understands itself and its role. So I'm not sure whether our colleagues can engage a little bit with this discussion, but I think this identity issue goes beyond immediate policy making and shapes it from above, I would say. So I think that was my comment. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Licínia, for bringing us to the more macro level the discussion as well. That is important because it frames also the orientations, policy orientations, also the individual behaviors. Well, it was a bit more directed to Nevra because of the Eastern Partnership policies. I even say policies even instead of policy, as I know the presentation Nevra also showed the difference between countries and also the growing differences between countries that led Licínia to even raise the hypothesis that its identity has changed deeply the nature of this policy. So yes, I already see you on the screen. Thank you for your
thank you very much for your participation and for your contribution, Licínia, regarding your points. Well, actually, yes, we see an important shift in European neighborhood policy because, at the very initial steps, it was just, a way of a deeper partnership for these countries, and we have here the very important objective to have a ring of friends, but getting together, focusing on the important values of the European Union. So here, yes, we see actually an identity perspective. But when we see the recent shift, considering the changing dynamics due to the Russia-Ukraine war, we see actually important security concerns of the European Union and shift in the strategic interests of the European Union. That's why the European Union now has reshaped its neighborhood policy to become much more involved in this area, especially considering the issues of energy, transport. So these very specific important issues led the European Union to reshape its neighborhood policy. And in that perspective, I think we need to look at this policy now in a broad perspective at a macro level, as we say.
Thank you, Nevra.
Thank you.
I don't know if someone else wants to seize this opportunity. We are in the last minutes. It's 4 minutes before 11, so to 11. We started sharp on time. So if there are no more questions, it gives everyone 4 minutes for coffee, for something before jumping to the next panel. That is at 11. So I invite you to come back to this same link, which is the link for the full day of the conference, and to engage in the next panel that, I'm sorry, I'm not able to find out at the moment, but it's panel 10 and it's just at 11. Thank you to everyone for your engagement, for your time, and with the time zone differences. I know it's a bigger effort in the other time zones. So thank you very much. And I wish CESRAN2023 a great day. We were the first panel, and it has been a great conference. I was in Lisbon myself on Tuesday, and it was really, really great to be there and to engage with everyone. So see you next year, I hope. And in the meantime, in our academic life or research life. Bye-bye.